What's going on, people? This is Akala and we are going to be discussing Black British history today. So right at the start, I would like to say that if you are interested in Black British history, there are really 3 fantastic books in this area that if you read these 3, kind of covers most of the scholarship that there is. The first one of these, and the most well-known and most famous, is a book called Stay in Power by Peter Fryer. The next of these is Black and British by David Olusoga. And the third is Black People in the British Empire, also by Peter Fryer. And in a way, that third book is sort of the most important. The reason why I would say, even though it's the smallest, and it doesn't actually cover what happens here in Britain, it covers the most neglected part of Black British history. Britain had a political relationship, a political union, albeit one based on conquest and slavery, with, say, Jamaica, or England did, before Britain existed. Yeah, England was in a political union with Jamaica before it was in a political union with Scotland. Yeah, Britain was an empire. England and Scotland both had overseas territories before the Act of Union. And most Caribbeans and South Asians that came here after World War II came here as British citizens. Many of them war veterans and so on and so forth. So people remember that Britain had an empire, not that it was an empire. So the history made in British India, in British Jamaica, in British Guyana, in British Ghana, in British Nigeria was British history and was part of the history that shaped the metropole. There's also a great book called Insurgent Empire by Priyam Vadagopal, which looks at the influence of insurgent movements and revolutionary movements and political ideas from the colonies on Britain itself. Yeah, so again, it's history that worked both ways, or as which scholar was it that said, we did not come to Britain, Britain came to us. So it's important to remember. Black people in Britain didn't begin with the British conquest, it began with the Roman conquest. During the Roman conquest of Britain, most people forget, Rome was also an African empire. Large tracts of North Africa were part of the Roman Empire. And we see under Roman occupation people that are believed to be of African heritage. Specifically a woman imaginatively titled Ivory Bangle Lady, because they found an ivory bangle in her gravesite. But after the Roman period, we see really not much record of Black people in British history until the Tudor period. Another fantastic book, literally called The Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufman, you should read. And in this period we see free people, we see servants. Britain has not yet fully entered the slave trade, or the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, as I prefer to call it, though it's a mouthful. And so the Black people in Britain in this time are servants, and there's certainly racism in Britain at this period of time, but the assumption that they were slaves in a legal sense is not always accurate, certainly not for that Tudor period. So you see people like John Blank, he was called John Blank because he was black, and people are so clever that calling someone John White when they're clearly black is apparently a good joke. But he was a trumpet player at the court of Henry VII, and we know that he was paid, he was a paid worker, etc. And there were other paid workers in that period of time. But there was also racism, or bigotry, not just towards the black population, but towards foreigners in general. But it was an interesting time. Shakespeare writes a whole series of sonnets, sonnet 127 to 152, about his so-called Dark Lady. Now, scholars call her the Dark Lady, but as you can see, Shakespeare continually refers to the woman as black. And it was from these sonnets that I took the influence for my novel, The Dark Lady. And so then the Tudor period passes, and the next kind of significant period in a way in Black British history is the 18th century. And during the 18th century we see lots of prominent black abolitionists and political radicals and people you should look up and check out and be interested in, you know, to overcome what I call the Windrush myth. You know, usually until recently the story of Black Britain, until the great work of David Olusoga, particularly in his documentaries, the story of Black Britain began in 1948 with the Windrush. And now we know there's a much longer engagement with Africa in the Caribbean, but also a much longer presence of black people in the British Isles, and I think the public consciousness of that is rising. So I want you, for your homework, to go away and check out some of the following prominent figures. You want to check out abolitionists: Ottobah Kwagwano, Mary Prince, Alada Equiano, and Ignatius Sancho, who is one of the only surviving witnesses we have to the Gordon riots of 1780, in which 280 people were killed. He's a black man living in Britain at the time, and he's also commemorated on a stamp in Trinidad and Tobago. During this period, you also see significant black radicals shaping the character of British working class struggle. Most significantly, Robert Wedderburn, William Cuffey, who was the leader of the Chartist Party, which was a movement for free speech, who was eventually deported to Tasmania for exercising his free speech, and William Davidson. William Davidson, his dad was the Governor General of Jamaica, his mum was an enslaved African woman. He was free, he came to Britain, he studied in Glasgow, moved to London. He becomes part of what is called the Cato Street Conspiracy. Yeah. So in 1819 there is a march on Peterloo in Manchester where people are marching for parliamentary reform. The local military constabulary, or the yeomen, charge through the marchers on horseback and hack 15 protesters to death. Needless to say, people in Britain were not very happy at this time, and as a response to this, a group of activists in London attempted, or at least thought they were attempting, to kill the British government. They were not. They were set up by a government agent. So a government agent had come to them actually with the idea of killing the government to frame them. This sounds very conspiratorial, but you can literally read the scholarship on it. It's well established fact. So they were set up by a government agent who said he had the guns and the equipment and all of that sort of stuff. And on the day that they come to carry out this Cato Street conspiracy, the police come. There's a shootout with the police. They're caught. And 4 of the conspirators are publicly hung. Their bodies are dissolved in quicklime, hung and beheaded, and their bodies are dissolved in quicklime. And it is the largest public execution in British history. So big, massive event. Eventually, parliamentary reform does come, but it's in this context of the Cato Street conspiracy. And William Davidson, a man of African heritage, coming from an enslaved African woman in Jamaica, plays a role in this really significant event in British history.